Well, welcome all to the Montague Barker Lecture Series, and we have the second in the series from given by Michael Nasser Ali on Anglican mission. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Michael. Go ahead, Michael, and I will put up the share screen as well.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning, brothers and sisters. You will remember, those who were there last time, that we considered the prehistory of Anglican mission, necessarily somewhat uncertain, and then also the early history of how England in particular was evangelized both from the southern mission that came from Italy and from the north, almost simultaneously. And how the issues that arose amongst the two sets of missionaries were resolved, or an attempt was made to resolve them at the Synod of Whitby. We then also saw how Anglo-Saxon missionaries themselves evangelized very important parts of the European continent. And all of that is of course important for our understanding of the whole orientation of an Anglican understanding of mission. There was one question that Tom had asked about the relationship of the German epic Hellion to the Anglo-Saxon mission. The epic, as some will know, was about the contextualization of the gospel into Germanic culture in the vernacular, and also to present Christ in a German way. I mean, full of opportunity and danger, everything there, as we know from later history. But the only link that there seems to be with the German epic and the Anglo-Saxon mission was that St. Fulda's, the monastery where it was probably written, was founded, of course, by Boniface, St. Boniface, and it was a favorite place of his. But others may know more about it. So today, we are looking at the more immediate past, and particularly the evangelical and Catholic revivals in the Church of England, and then in the Anglican Communion as a whole. So the question is, how did the morality-based Anglicanism of the 17th century, typified by people like Jeremy Taylor, Sanderson, and even Baxter, how did that change to one so passionately concerned with the proclamation of the gospel of forgiveness and salvation, both overseas and at home? Now, I have spoken before of the three ways in which Anglicanism spread throughout the world, and I've called these the coincidental spread of Anglicanism, the evangelical spread, and the Catholic spread of Anglicanism. And those are the three main ways in which the Anglican Communion became a worldwide communion and what it is today. So first of all, it spread alongside the settlement of English-speaking peoples in different parts of the world. And naturally, as they went, they took their church with them and generally took care that it looked as much like the church at home as was possible. So here is a picture of St. Paul's Church, Halifax. I've preached there. And if you go in, there's a notice in the ground saying, this is the first British church on Canadian soil. So that was the attitude to a church for English-speaking peoples as they settled in other parts of the world. So such settlements needed pastoral care and teaching, and these were sometimes provided by official chaplains, as in the East India Company. But towards the very end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, two societies were formed. the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, SPCK, and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG. The main aim of these societies was to evangelize, was to provide ministrations of the church to British people overseas. That was their main aim, to minister to English-speaking peoples who had settled overseas. But there was a secondary one, which was to evangelize the non-Christian races subject to the crown, I quote. In the fulfilling of both of these aims, they cooperated with Lutherans in matters like Bible translation and distribution, and in providing pastoral care for settlers, troops, and local converts. Quite remarkably, for high church societies as they were, they found no difficulty in accepting the sacramental and pastoral ministry of German and Danish Lutherans who had not received episcopal ordination in the Anglican sense. And this was, of course, to change later on, but that is how it was then. So such were the early and hopeful developments in the emergence of missionary awareness among Anglicans. A radical change, however, was to come with the evangelical revival in the Church of England and beyond. The roots of this revival can be traced to an outburst of itinerancy in Wales around the 1730s. The Welsh were soon joined by George Whitefield and the Wesley brothers. Tom, do you want to put them up? So there are the two great evangelists of the 18th century, Whitefield and Wesley, together. Not very flattering portraits of them, but there we are. David Bebbington, historian of the evangelical movement, identifies its leading characteristics as conversionism, that is bringing people to living faith in Christ, activism, that is being active socially and politically in society, biblicism, by which I think he means close attention to the teaching of the scriptures, and what he calls crucicentrism, that is to say the centrality of the cross, the atoning work of Christ on the cross. Each is vitally important in our understanding of evangelicals, but it was the huge energy released for bringing people to faith and to an assurance of forgiveness and of salvation, as long as they remained faithful and showed forth the fruit of faith in good works. It is this which needs to engage our attention. For with religion no longer dominated by moralism and its constant need to prove that a person was good enough for God, the Bible's promise of free pardon released evangelicals from making their own salvation the focus of their piety, so that they could turn their attention to the salvation of others. As a result, we are once again drawn back to the peregrinations of the early Scot, Irish, and Anglo-Saxon missionaries, about which we discussed last time. It is the constant movement of the preachers from one town or village to another, from one meeting or congregation to another, from one section of the population to another, which arrests our attention. John Wesley himself is supposed to have preached 40,000 sermons in his ministry. Others, incumbents in the Church of England and ministers in the Church of Scotland, are seen to be equally active, either within their parishes or even beyond them. They reach out to the gentry as well as to the rural and urban poor, and the concern is always to bring people to Christ and to deepen their faith. Whether such an itinerant mission is needed now in an increasingly sedentary church is a question being asked today by those who long to see a fresh evangelization in the West. But to this we shall return in due course in this series. This energy of the early evangelicals could not be contained within the confines of Great Britain, however many the opportunities there. It spilled over into a concern for the unevangelized in other parts of the world and the duty of Christians to reach them. One of the features of the revival was not to wait for official approval, church or state, but to strike out with like-minded friends, to form societies and prayer groups for the fulfillment of whatever vision God had given those involved in the revival. I think the next one, Tom. One of the catalysts for mission at home and abroad was the newly rediscovered doctrine of means, or the use of human agency by God for the fulfillment of his purposes. The pioneer missionary William Carey declared that God used means for the conversion of the heathen. And we are to ask whether we were those means. Have you got a picture of Carey? Yeah, William Carey the cobbler. Quite an amazing man who, although not formally educated, mastered the classical and the modern languages of India and translated the Bible into a number of them, particularly into Bengali. I think he revised the Bengali Bible 8 times, established Fort William College, which developed the vernacular languages of India to become proper vehicles for literature and particularly religious literature, of course. But he was also a scholar of Sanskrit. So Carey declared that God uses means for the conversion of the heathen, and we are to ask whether we were those means. This was a kind of complement to the emphasis otherwise in Reformed thought on the sovereignty of God. And in this, Carey anticipated Jonathan Edwards, the great Puritan preacher and writer. The distinct contribution of evangelicals was not the formation of societies, as we have seen these could be and were formed by others. Their distinctive contribution was the introduction of the voluntary principle, that is, the duty of every Christian to be aware of God's calling for them and to respond to this either individually or by joining it with like-minded people. It is this which led to the proliferation of voluntary societies for the fulfillment of multifarious aims and objects. The non-denominational London Missionary Society was formed in 1795 for mission overseas, to be closely followed by the Church Missionary Society in 1799. The latter was explicitly Anglican, signaled by the word church in its title, but also voluntary in that it did not depend on being established as an official body of the church, as the previous societies had been, and it raised its finances independently from voluntary giving. The formation of the Church Pastoral Aid Society in 1836 for the provision of ordained and lay workers for the church, the Ragged Schools for the poorest, the National Society for Elementary Education, which made church-based education universally available for the first time, the movement against the slave trade and slavery itself, William Wilberforce's and Hannah More's project for the reformation of manners, the Clapham sects, and later evangelical campaigns to improve working conditions for men, women, and children, and the revival of nursing as a noble profession were all either begun by evangelicals or benefited from their energy. In this connection, I was interested to see that the makeshift hospital set up in the Excel Center and other such hospitals are being called the Nightingale hospitals. Have you got a picture of Florence Nightingale? Well, there she is, and a great Christian lady she was, and to her and to her colleagues we owe the revival of nursing as a caring profession, and it had explicitly Christian roots, and for a long time continued to do so in this country. According to Bebbington, although evangelicals were biblically based, they were also deeply influenced by Enlightenment ideas, especially in their view of the human person and his or her relation to the world, especially on questions of human dignity, equality, and the importance of experience in the gaining of knowledge. I have pointed out elsewhere that it was this evangelical Enlightenment consensus which created many of the institutions with which we are familiar and which remained in place in this country until this consensus was challenged and eroded, though not destroyed, by the social revolution of the 1960s in the Western world. Although both SPCK and SPG can be thought of as high church societies, the Catholic revival in the Church of England, which followed John Keeble's assize sermon on national apostasy, also resulted in a fresh awareness of the missionary tasks of the church. The occasion of the sermon, you will remember, was the attempt by the state to suppress a certain number of Irish bishoprics, Anglican bishoprics in Ireland. And the question was not whether they should be suppressed, because clearly there seemed to be too many of them, but who had the right and the responsibility to do so. The great historian of Tractarian Anglo-Catholic mission, Bishop John Davis, points out that at first this revival seems not to have been concerned with missionary issues very much. Its initial tracts of the times were directed towards the nature of the church and proper obedience to it. But in the course of time, he claims the Catholic revival in Anglicanism has made its mark primarily as a missionary movement. We can ask then how such a turnaround came to pass and what were its consequences. One catalyst was the desire of many in the movement to serve and worship in churches that were free, I quote, free of the Erastian taint of the Church of England. Thus, Harold Froude and John Henry Newman in his Anglican days were very taken with the romantic idea of being bishops in India without the trammels of the English episcopate. Although there were no offers to them, others like them were to become a feature of the Anglican episcopate in India. The great Bishop Selwyn of New Zealand, the first Bishop of New Zealand, although not a missionary bishop, sometimes he's called that, but he wasn't, became a model for the Tractarians of what a bishop should be like. As Bishop Samuel Wilberforce of Oxford, well known for his confrontation with Huxley, as he put it, these missionary type bishops showed the English bishops and the English church that a bishop was not a sort, I quote, not a sort of embossed ornament to stand at the top of the banister, but was rather necessary to the ordering of the church and fundamental to its missionary task. The main catalyst, however, was David Livingstone's famous Commerce and Christianity speech at the Senate House in Cambridge in 1857. You got Livingstone there? No, sorry, that was Keeble. We should have had him. That was the assize sermon. Carry on. I think you're going back, Tom. If you go forward. Yeah, Henry Newman then. George Selwyn. There's David Livingstone. Okay. You remember his speech about commerce and Christianity for Africa. And this remark has often been misunderstood. Livingstone was arguing for genuine trading relations with Africa rather than falling into the temptation of the lucrative slave trade. As to Christianity, he had long argued that Christians should be prepared to go wherever the slave trader went and to supplant such trade with holistic mission. Livingstone did this himself, as did the early missionaries, but their advance was regularly disrupted, as I have seen, myself in East Africa by Arab slave traders. In any case, the speech in Cambridge led, among many other results, to the formation of the university's mission to Central Africa. As I have said elsewhere, it is most remarkable that a Scottish Congregationalist, David Livingstone, should inspire and assist in the founding of an Anglo-Catholic society. The society concentrated on missionary bishops planting churches which reflected what Catholic Anglicans thought the primitive church was like. There was an emphasis from the beginning on prophetic witness against slavery and the slave trade. The building of the Anglican Cathedral in Zanzibar, on the very site of the old slave market, with the altar being where the whipping post had been, is an enduring icon of the missionary stance against evil. The SPG, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, already high church as opposed to CMS being merely church, was also affected by the Catholic revival and indeed became one of the main vehicles for Catholic Anglican involvement in world mission. The amalgamation of the two societies, the SPG and the University's Mission to Central Africa, UMCA, to form the USPG in 1965 was a very significant event in Anglican missionary history. John Davis has shown how the commitment to social justice is seen in the opposition to slavery, but was also at work later on, for example, in Bishop Frank Weston's relentless struggle against forced labor imposed on the Africans by the colonial authorities, and in the involvement of so many of Anglo-Catholicism's finest missionaries in the long struggle against apartheid. It was, however, Frank Weston himself who, at the Anglo-Catholic Congress of 1923, again drew the attention of his brothers and sisters to poverty in Britain. According to him, worship of Jesus in the church should lead us to his presence in the slums of industrial Britain at that time. This has indeed been an Anglo-Catholic commitment from almost the very beginnings of the movement. Talented priests went willingly to work in the poorest parishes. Sometimes they were the only ones available to them. Brian King at St. George's in the East, Alexander McConaughey in St. Albans, Holborn, as well as William Upton Richards of All Saints Margaret Street, who was, along with Sister Harriet, the founder of the All Saints Sisters of the Poor, one of the first religious orders for women to be founded in the post-Reformation Church of England. All of these readily come to mind. There are many other examples. It's difficult to believe that Margaret Street today, just off Oxford Street, was in an area of considerable poverty, but it was. The background was always the terrible poverty in the cities of industrial Britain and the desire of godly parish clergy to find assistance in meeting the needs of the poor. In this connection, Father Peter Mayhew of Oxford, historian of the All Saints Sisters, who now, of course, have their home in Oxford and Cowley, tells us that it was not just that God was calling young women to a life of celibacy, prayer, and holiness. He was also calling them to a life of charity, to service among the weak and the poor, the aged, and the orphaned. This tension between a contemplative life and a life of active service has remained with religious orders, not just in Anglicanism, but in many parts of the church. And we will come back to this, of course, in due course. Another very good example of such commitment and service and its mission significance is the community of St. John the Divine. This was made famous, the work was made famous by the television series called The Midwife. This was an order of nurses and their lay associates, now celebrated in Jennifer Worth's trilogy about her work with them, and the television series based on the books, which at its peak was attaining dizzying ratings. I see that it is now being rescreened. Worth's work has been a witness to Christian love for the poor, which reached millions who were probably unreachable in any other way. It seems that the revival of the religious life for both men and women in the Anglican Communion was oriented to service as well as to prayer and contemplation. The enclosed and contemplative orders came later. I mean, there is a contemplative order very near from where I'm speaking in West Malling, located within the Diocese of Rochester, but they came after orders like St. John the Divine and the All Saint Sisters of the Poor. As the religious order spread to different parts of the world, they took their commitment of working with the poor with them. This involved them in rescuing orphans from destitution, establishing and running schools both for the poor and for others, nursing in hospitals, and many other kinds of service. Such involvement was not, of course, limited to the orders. Many other ordained and lay people also gave a part, sometimes the whole of their lives, to mission in these ways. Some of their paternalism and attitudes to race may make us uncomfortable today, but there is no doubting the commitment of both evangelical and Catholic Anglican missionaries. About West Africa, for instance, it is often said that some of the missionaries who went out with CMS took their coffins with them. They did not expect to return. So there's no doubting their commitment, although they were people of their time. And our perception that they were children of their time should alert us to our own rootedness in our own times and cultures. And if there is a need, to transcend those times and cultures in the cause of the gospel. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. We will now open it up for questions. I'm looking for those hands. Here we go. David Singh. David, I've unmuted you. Please go ahead.
Well, sorry, Bishop, to be the very first person to ask the question. I should have waited, I think, a little longer.
Well, someone's got to start.
But I've been thinking about the book I recently read by William Dalrymple.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yes, I know him.
Yeah, he's a fantastic historian of South Asia. And one of his books I recently read is titled White Mughals.
Yes, yes.
Where he seems to be arguing that the Great Awakening that took place towards the end of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century was also responsible for what he calls the increasing racism in India and demeaning attitude towards mixed races, that is the Eurasians, Hindus and Muslims, and discontinuity between Christianity and Hinduism, Islam on the other hand. And this must have been really a bad way to promote Christianity in a place like South Asia. Because I understand prior to this, before the arrival of the evangelical missionaries in South Asia, there was greater intermixing between the East India Company officials and the local Indians. To all intents and purposes, the East India Company officials actually lived like Indian nobles and behaved like Indian nobles. And there was great intermixing between them. Could you say a little bit more about what you know of this part of the history of South Asia?
Yes, I mean the story is very mixed. I mean, the East India Company discouraged Christian mission. So when the CMS, for instance, began its work in India, it had to begin in the so-called native princely state of Travancore, among the ancient churches of India, the St. Thomas Christians, because they were not allowed to work in the territories of the East India Company. And even William Carey, although he began in the territories of the East India Company, he was forced to relocate at Serampore, which was, of course, Danish territory. And much of his work was done from there. Yeah, there were a number of watersheds. I think some people hold that racist attitudes began to be more widespread when the families of the missionaries and also women missionaries began to arrive. And the desire, therefore, to protect them, as it were, from other races. This kind of attitude you also find in a different way in the United States, with the Jim Crow legislation and so on. But I think the real catalyst for racism was the way in which the work of people like Charles Darwin was misused. Darwin himself was very aware of this, that his work could be misinterpreted in a racist direction, and for this reason gave huge amounts of money to the abolitionist cause in the United States. But that kind of understanding that there is a kind of hierarchy of being, and therefore there must be a hierarchy within the human races, and with the white man, who was then dominant, of course, because of colonization, being at the top, and the others distributed in, in various ways. What was Kipling's phrase? Half savage, half child.
Yes.
So, of course, the way in which they dealt with India was different from how people were dealt with in Africa, in some ways, because they could, to some extent, understand the literary heritage of India. And in fact, Carey, Marshman, Ward, his colleagues, all concentrated very much on the literature of India and set a pattern of how to engage with Indian cultures. But in CMS, for instance, the racism was shown in the blank refusal by missionaries to accept the authority of native bishops, whether in Africa or in Asia. The kind of convoluted defense of this that was mounted in the highest missionary circles, a prominent victim, of course, of this in the end was Crowther himself in Africa, whose episcopate was ruined really by this kind of attitude. In India, it meant that the kind of stringent demands made for a native episcopate meant that there was no Indian Anglican bishop until Bishop Azariah.
Yes.
I mean, it's quite incredible. So, yes, I think there are a number of features that we need to take into account of the rise of racism within missionary societies. It didn't exist at first. I mean, the slave trade, the campaigning against the slave trade, there were posters of African slaves saying, "Is he not a friend and a brother?"
Yeah. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, David. We'll turn now to Charles. I'm unmuting yours. Well, let me unmute you. Okay, go ahead, Charles. No, let me, there you go.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mishnah. for an outstanding address. I wrote some notes and I'm going to have to read them again. And as I speak, your face is frozen. I wonder whether we've lost Michael.
No, he's
No,
there.
I can.
You're there. Okay. So you mentioned the cooperation between evangelicals and Catholics. And this reminded me of the movement in the early 90s, 94, I think, when the paper was written, an informal paper on evangelicals and Catholics together. And Jim Packer, famously evangelical Jim Packer, signed it and stated his agreement to it. So my question is, what about the doctrinal conformity? Especially the central theme of that paper, which was we're justified by grace through faith, I assume, based on Ephesians chapter 2. And so I've got really two questions in one. In that movement you described, when there was some cooperation, how did they reconcile any doctrinal differences there on that fundamental doctrine of grace? And the second part is, does it exist today?
Yes, well, the second part is more important. I think the first part, I was talking, of course, of Anglican Catholics and evangelicals.
Right.
Not Roman Catholics and evangelicals, though there was cooperation across denominations as well, but also rivalry. I mean, we can't deny that. One of the features of the arrival of Western mission in many parts of the world was to divide the existing church. So the St. Thomas Christians of southern India, for instance, are now divided into, well, I mean, it varies, it depends when you count, but in something like 8 different denominations. And some of this, you can't lay at the blame of Western missions, but some you can. So it was not always cooperation, but certainly Stephen Neal, the historian of mission, says that the SPG and CMS in different parts of the world, for the most part, were able to cooperate, though sometimes rivalry and territorial ambition broke out. There were some apart from the justification question, the justification question actually was an internal question for Anglicanism for a long time. That's why I referred to moralism. In the 17th century, both in the High Church and in the Puritan inclined sections of the Anglican Church, there became a great concern for holiness of living. I mean, the Wesleys themselves were involved in it before their conversion. And this led almost to a kind of salvation by works, even if one of those works was called faith. I mean, faith can also become a work. I mean, this is Fitzsimmons Allison, the great American bishop, has very trenchantly criticized Baxter on making faith a work. What is the situation now, you ask? Well, I think I can refer to no better work than, I don't know what you call him now, but Pope Emeritus Benedict's little book on Paul. It's called Paul of Tarsus, in which he says, referring to Romans 3:28, I think it is, he says that for 500 years, Roman Catholic exegetes have been saying that in those words, for we are justified by faith alone and not through works, the word alone does not occur in the text, monos. And he says, so in that they're right. But in translating the verse and using the term alone, that we are justified by faith alone and not through works, Martin Luther got the sense of the scripture right, got the sense of the scripture better than the Catholic exegetes. So this is a German Pope talking about the German Reformer. And I think that is since the Roman Catholic Lutheran agreement on justification, and we can argue about the technicalities of it, but the Roman Catholic Church has agreed that justification by faith is a cornerstone doctrine of the Church, which orients the Church in every other respect to Christ. So in the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue, for instance, ARCIC, of which I was a member for many years, the then newly appointed prefect for the Council for Christian Unity came to address us. And he said, you must understand that for the Catholic Church now, justification by faith is a cornerstone doctrine. And this surprised many of my Anglican colleagues because I don't think for them it was a cornerstone doctrine. I wish that it were.
Okay, we'll turn now to Alfred Cooper. Alfred, go ahead.
Dear Bishop Michael, it's very hard for a Chilean Anglican not to be immediately asking questions, or rather giving an illustration from which maybe you'll comment. The Coopers, my family, arrived in 1862 to Chile. That's why I speak a little like a Victorian Englishman, a bit like probably yourself. I don't know, we got our English from our grannies. And we were raised in the Anglo-Catholic St. Andrew's Church, which was, as you say, devoted to good works, the Mothers' Union. We were always doing things for the poor. I was a Boy Scout in that church. Unknown to me at that same time, this is now talking about the 1960s or 50s, 60s, down in the deep south, the evangelical Anglicans, SAMs, were working among the indigenous peoples, the Mapuches. And they, what I'm trying to come to is this interesting clash that took place between the evangelical Anglicans and the Anglo-Catholics, not around doctrine so much, because I don't think they were into doctrine too much, evangelicals were little, but around the actual nature of ecclesiology and mission. For instance, I didn't know that my wife, who was being brought up in that context in a missionary family, was coming along for me, but her father, Tony Barrett, pioneer in TEE, had the tremendous clash with the bishop, the Anglo-Catholic bishop in Santiago, because he wanted to ordain these indigenous people. He brought 3 candidates for ordination, and he had to fight so much because they did not want to ordain them. The bishop didn't want to ordain these indigenous people. This kind of clash between evangelical mission and Anglo-Catholic ecclesiology took place in Santiago and Buenos Aires. And I just would like you to comment on that a bit. Even this morning in my mail, funnily enough, I got a request from a bishop, someone in England, wanting us bishops in Chile to ordain an evangelical to become a bishop or an incumbent, I think it is, an incumbent in Rio de Janeiro. So this is still on, this sort of tension clash. Could you just comment on that? In other parts of the world, Chile was not a colonial country. The British never colonized Latin America, and that's why they're very loved in Latin America, because they developed commerce. But in the background was this interesting Anglican scenario, which even to this day rather mystifies other Protestant evangelicals in Latin America. That's my example from Latin America, and I just want you to comment on that if you'd be so kind.
Yeah, so there were several reasons for this. I mean, the first was that bishops who were appointed by the crown with letters patent were quite limited in who they could ordain. They were limited to, or they thought they were limited to ordaining only English people. This changed gradually in different parts of the world, this understanding of what authority such bishops had, whether they could go beyond the so-called established church that they were supposed to be representing. And I know that in Latin America, you have both those Anglicans whose origins are in the SAM's mission, and those whose origins are in the chaplaincies that were created for expatriates.
Right.
So I think that was one reason. The second reason, specifically for Anglo-Catholics, was that they regarded Latin America as already evangelized because of the presence of the Roman Catholic Church. And they did not want to create parallel bishoprics in that country. So there was a long dispute about whether Latin American bishops whether there should be Latin American Anglican bishops, and whether they should attend conferences like the Lambeth Conference.
Yeah.
The third reason, and Bishop Selwyn, George Augustus Selwyn, the first Bishop of New Zealand, was implicated in this dispute about what the qualifications for indigenous clergy should be. And there was a long dispute with CMS. CMS wanted to ordain Maori clergy as soon as possible. But Selwyn insisted that they should not be ordained until they attained the kinds of educational standards of English origin clergy. So knowledge of Hebrew and Greek and so on. CMS thought that this would unduly delay, as it did, the emergence of an indigenous church in New Zealand, and it certainly did that. I mean, I think now, looking back, Selwyn was mistaken in such a demand. But the irony of it is that in many parts of the world where I go to teach, and perhaps others do here, those training for ordination are learning Hebrew and Greek, whereas many ordinands, perhaps the majority of ordinands in this country, are not learning the biblical languages at all.
Thank you.
That leads me to a question, Michael, and a comment as well. One of the things you didn't talk a whole lot on, though it touched on a little bit with Carrie, is this whole area of translation of the word and the kind of power dynamic that has both ways. So one of the things in terms of my own studies in China is that the word allows the local Christians to criticize the missionary and to criticize the church, because it gives them a point to stand. And there's a very good paper that was presented in Mizoram by Anton Knut. And what Anton brought out both in New Guinea and Africa, when the colonization wave began to ebb and recede, one of the often a common denominator is please leave the word. You may go and the empire may go, but we appreciate what you brought in terms of the word of God and the kind of power it evokes. I know at least in China, the whole rising of common speech, or what we call putonghua, was a direct result of the translation of scriptures. Because before that you had classical Chinese, but it's only when you get the translation into modern Chinese, and that what took place with the formation of the Chinese Union version. But what are your sort of thoughts in terms of social justice and translation of the word and the transformation that's brought by missions and Anglican mission?
Yes, we will consider later on this whole question of inculturation and what Bible translation has to do within that wider context, because you can't separate translating the Bible from that wider question. And I will look at obviously at Lamin Sane's work in this area, but also Kwame Bediako, who has of course had strong relations with the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. We will do that, but the point about the Bible was that it also gave missionaries, not just the indigenous church, a reason from time to time to oppose the imperial and the colonial authorities. So I mentioned Frank Weston's work today, who opposed at great cost to himself the imposition of forced labor in East Africa on the Africans. In the Caribbean, the CMS opposed the slave trade and slavery itself. Although other societies were implicated in it, it has to be said. So the relationship of even the Anglican Church to empire was not always straightforward. Sometimes there was cooperation and collaboration, good or bad, and sometimes there was tension and even opposition. But that was also true with regard to indigenous leadership as it emerged. I mean, in India, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi is known for quoting the Christian Bible at Christians and things like that. The West generally understands him as sympathetic to Christianity. But he was adamantly opposed to Indian Christians, and particularly to the work of Bishop Azariah, who I think during his episcopate was responsible for the baptism of 500,000 people. Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Would that bishops today were. I mean, some are, of course, but would that all were.
I guess no one's raised their hand, so I'll follow up. Often I find that people are very critical, rightly so, of the reformation of manners, because manners are seen as cultural imposition.
Yes.
But one of the things that I've done in my own research, at least looking, for instance, in the US, in the mid-Atlantic states, and what was going on with Methodist movements and Presbyterian movements of mission movement in the sense within the African slave community, is that resulted in real transformation of society and empowering of persons who previously had been marginalized, and so to gain power in terms of morals and virtues, transformed society and actually transformed even the elite and the powerful by challenging their immorality. So,
yes, I think by manners they meant what we would today call morals. And I mean, for instance, in Britain, the whole question about the abuse of alcohol and what that did to families and to children and to women, the exploitation of one group by another. I mean, that's what they meant by manners. If you read Hannah More's little stories, that is what they're about. Good habits, habits of work rather than laziness, those kinds of things. And of course, you know, there were people of that time, as I was saying, and they put things in that way. But at least some of the things they did change society in ways that we now simply assume as being part of society, but they weren't. I mean, just to take an example of the Nadars in South India, the Nadars were a despised outcast group, and low caste people in that part of South India, the women were not allowed to cover their breasts with the sari. And it was the arrival of Christian mission that gave women that dignity. I mean, the Nadars also became leaders in education and medical care and so on. And now the situation is, Becky Shah has done some work on this. The situation is that the high caste now come to the Nadars for education and medicine. I think that's what, at its best, that is what reformation of manners meant.
okay, we'll turn to Ben. And Ben, I'm unmuting you, so go ahead.
The missionary society's activity coincided to a large extent with the expansion of Britain and Europe around the world. And of course, it's a favorite with various secular academic pursuits to see them as purely as part of empire, as of that expansion. However, evangelicals were, I think it's fair to say, rather untypical of British society. Charles Simeon of the Clapham sect found continual hostility in Cambridge to his ministry. And then later in the century, you had the Cambridge Seven, converted through the evangelism of Moody, and people like Douglas Hooper and others who went out to pioneer Anglican mission in East Africa. And these people tended to be highly countercultural, not counter local culture, but counter their own British culture. So Douglas Hooper was for decades refusing to accept almost any authority that came from Europe. His mission was to the natives. That was his concern. He was still a child of his times. But how much do you think that there is sufficient tension between British evangelicals and British culture to ameliorate the cultural expansion of Europe?
Yes, I think that did depend on who they were. I mean, the Clapham sect were very much integrated into British culture. There were very often people of means, and there were people with political influence as well, which is why they were able to bring about some of the changes that they did. But there were others who were not like that at all, as you say, who were countercultural. And even those, I mean, even if you look at the Clapham sect, the way in which they argued against the slave trade and slavery itself went against cultural norms when it began. I mean, they changed public opinion through their campaigns. That is also true. But at first, many people who were very hostile to them, including many churchmen. I'm trying to think of another example of someone who would have been. I mean, one mistake that was made, for example, in the collaboration of mission with the colonial enterprise and commerce, was the mission up the Niger, where, you see, the point was that the missionaries had to use the civil and commercial facilities to get the mission to where they wanted it to go. They had no other way of doing it. But it compromised them, and in the end, it corrupted them, I think. And it also brought about some of the racist attitudes that were being talked about. I think the Anglo-Catholic missionaries were probably better at being countercultural because in this country, they deliberately went to the poorest parts of the cities. They deliberately rejected their own background sometimes. And when they went abroad, Frank Weston was throughout countercultural he was nearly all the time in opposition to the colonial authorities of his day. That is also the case with the missionaries in Southern Africa, who became household names in their opposition to apartheid. So I'm not sure whether we can label missionaries evangelical or Catholic. I think there were many even we might say, who were countercultural at home as well as abroad. 'Abroad. 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 'Abroad.
Yes, you mentioned earlier about the high church missionary societies that were founded, I think about 1700, like SPG, and how they work so comfortably alongside the Lutherans. They accepted the Lutheran ordination, etc., or the authority for them to conduct sacraments and things like that. And there's a perhaps slightly similar thing that happened, at least according to one of the theses I examined here. The Anglican Church in Uganda, when it first arrived, was very non-hierarchical and very open to women ministry. That over the years, it became much more rigid in its attitude towards women. Now, the student I was examining was looking at the way the church in the Democratic Republic of Congo had been affected by this, and he was very touchy about the degree of hierarchy in the Anglican Church in the Congo. But it seemed as if when missionaries first arrive, they're doctrinally or ecclesially much more flexible than one generation down the line. I wondered whether this is a general truth or just the exceptional.
Well, no, I think it is a general truth. I mean, there is an institutionalization, isn't there, that you first have the conversion and the enthusiasm of that and the success of that, if that has been the case. But then when the church has to be ordered and discipline has to be introduced, worship has to be organized in a particular way, the schools are created, then you need a certain kind of order. So, I mean, this happens in all sorts of cases, not just in the Christian church. I think it's partly that, but I think with Anglicans, there was a kind of indifference to questions of order until the Anglo-Catholic revival in the 1830s onwards, when the Anglo-Catholics began to say, we have received this ministry from the apostles' times, and it is not for us to compromise it or to give it away and to insist on episcopal ordination for people who are going to serve as clergy anyway in their missionary situations. And I think the Anglican insistence on things like apostolic succession and so on dates from that time. I mean, this is not just true of mission, it's also true of ecumenism, for instance, that the long drawn out negotiations over the Church of South India, much of the question was, how was this new united church going to retain apostolic succession? I mean, it's not a question just of organization or hierarchy, but of a succession from the apostles' time. And if the church did not satisfactorily retain such succession, then what would Anglican relations be with such a church? So when it came to church union negotiations in North India and Pakistan, and what is now Bangladesh, the Anglicans were very concerned that what happened to South India should not happen to them, that their ministries should be fully recognized by Anglicans and by others, but mainly Anglicans, from the very beginning. Those were the reasons why attitudes change. There's also, of course, the practical thing about availability. I mean, in the early days, whether for SPG or indeed for CMS, the only people who were available were German-speaking missionaries, either from what is now Switzerland or from Germany. There was no one else available. And it was only gradually that people from this country began to be called to mission overseas and to become available.
Thank you.
Good. Well, with that, I think we will wrap up. Just a note, there will be no lecture next week in that we have an OCMS meeting, but that Michael will be back on 12th May to continue the series, and there'll be 3 more lectures after this one. So thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
And appreciate your all attending. And with that, I will